Our next piece this evening is one of the most influential works of the 20th century. The Rite of Spring is a ballet composed by Igor Stravinsky in 1913. When you listen to the music, please remember that the music is meant to be staged, even though the piece is very frequently performed just for the music without ballet staging. Igor Stravinsky was born in Russia in 1882 near St. Petersburg. He originally trained to become a lawyer, but his musical education came from private lessons with the great composer Rimsky-Korsakov. Shortly after The Rite of Spring premiered, World War I began, and Stravinsky left Russia, never to live there again. The Russian Revolution made returning impossible, so he spent most of his life in exile, first in Switzerland, then France, and eventually the United States. Over time, he became not only one of the most important composers of the 20th century, but also a famous conductor of his own music, touring around the world. He wrote books and lectures about music and remained a major cultural figure until his death in 1971. Before The Rite of Spring was premiered, Stravinsky had already become a rising star thanks to two earlier ballets. The Firebird was his breakthrough, a lush, colorful score based on Russian fairy tales that immediately impressed Paris audiences and established his reputation. Just 1 year later, Petrushka went even further artistically. It told the tragic story of a puppet with human emotions and introduced more daring harmonies and rhythmic complexity. By the time Stravinsky was asked to write The Rite of Spring, he was no longer unknown. He was a celebrated young composer ready to take an even bigger artistic risk. Stravinsky recalled having a sudden musical vision around 1910. He imagined a pagan ritual in ancient Russia celebrating spring. In the vision, elders watched a young girl dance herself to death. The sacrifice was meant to appease the god of spring. This vision became the foundation of the Rite of Spring. Stravinsky is telling us that the piece began as a visual and emotional shock, not as a melody at the piano. The violence, the rhythm, and the raw energy of the Rite of Spring all grow out of this single dramatic image. Paris in 1913 was like New York in the 1960s, full of experimentation. Artists were breaking rules. Painters were inventing abstract art. Fashion was changing. Audiences expected something modern, but they still expected it to be beautiful. Stravinsky gave them something modern, but not comfortable. So imagine going to a concert expecting something beautiful and elegant, and instead hearing pounding rhythms, strange sounds, and music that feels almost violent. That's exactly what happened in Paris in 1913 when Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring premiered. People didn't just dislike it, they rioted. At the premiere, people shouted, they argued, some laughed, some fought, and the police were called. But here's the important part. The riot wasn't just about the music. The choreography was also shocking. Dancers stomped, bent inward, and moved awkwardly instead of gracefully. It looked primitive on purpose. Before this piece, classical music focused mainly on melody and harmony. Stravinsky made rhythm the star. You hear pounding accents, irregular beats, and patterns that feel almost like modern film music or even rock. It feels physical, almost like the earth itself is moving. So here's the story. The ballet tells a very simple and very disturbing story. In ancient pagan Russia, a tribe chooses a young girl to dance herself to death as a sacrifice to ensure the arrival of spring. So instead of a romantic ballet with princes and swans, we get primitive rituals, tribal dancing, sacrifice, nature as a brutal force. This was shocking to audiences used to graceful ballets like Swan Lake. Here's the structure of the piece. The piece has two main parts, like two acts of a play, about 35 minutes long in total. Part 1 is called The Adoration of the Earth. Spring arrives and tribes gather together. Part 2, The Sacrifice. A girl is chosen and she dances to death. The music is organized by scenes or rituals rather than traditional melodies. Strong rhythms and repeating patterns hold everything together. Part 1 of the piece depicts the ancient tribes celebrating the arrival of spring. Here's a description of each of the movements in Part 1. The piece begins with a bassoon playing extremely high, so high that audiences don't even recognize the instrument. It sounds lonely, ancient, almost prehistoric. Stravinsky wanted the sound of a world before civilization. This is part 2 of the piece, the sacrificial portion. It focuses on choosing and killing the sacrificial victim. So the deeper idea of the piece might be that nature is powerful and indifferent. Most classical romantic music celebrates human emotion. Stravinsky shows something different. Nature doesn't care about us. Spring comes through violence, melting ice, floods, storms, rebirth. The sacrifice symbolizes the cycle of life itself. So what should you listen for? When you hear this piece, notice repeating rhythms that build tension, sudden explosions of sound, layers of instruments playing different patterns, moments that feel chaotic but are actually carefully organized. It's less like a story and more like experiencing a force of nature. The most fascinating things about the Rite of Spring. Music that once caused a riot is now performed by orchestras everywhere, and audiences love it. It reminds us that art that feels shocking today often becomes tomorrow's masterpiece. Thank you and enjoy.